The moment Lenora Pratt set her hand on the back of his booth and said quietly and without raising her voice, "You're going to want to think very carefully about this." Nobody in Bev's diner moved. Not the couple near the front window. Not Simone, who had been holding a coffee pot at an angle that no longer made sense for the last 30 seconds. Not the older man at the corner table by the wall who had been reading a newspaper he hadn't turned the page of in quite some time. Because in Millport, the name Pratt had a specific gravity, the kind that pulled things toward it and kept them there. 3 years of land acquisitions, 2 approved development corridors, and a series of municipal meetings that had always seemed to resolve in a particular direction had given that name a quality people understood without having to articulate, which was perhaps the point. But the older man in the corner had set down his tea. He was watching the booth near the window with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a very long career learning that the most useful thing you could do in a difficult room was stay quiet and see everything. He reached for his phone. What happened after that would take 18 months, involve 9 witnesses, and eventually appear on the front page of the London Free Press under a headline that surprised almost no one who had been paying attention and thoroughly astonished the people who hadn't. But that was later. Bev's Diner had been on Millport's Main Street since 1993, which was longer than most businesses in town, and showed the way good places showed their age, not in where, exactly, but in depth. The booths were vinyl, a color that had started as burgundy and arrived somewhere more honest over the years. The menu was laminated and hadn't changed substantially since 2016, except for a gluten-free option that Bev had added reluctantly and referenced with mild resentment approximately once a month. The coffee was made in a machine that looked older than several of the regular customers, and was, without argument, reliably good. Felix Rourke had been coming here since he moved to Millport 4 years ago, and somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd month, Bev had started keeping the booth near the window available on Saturday mornings. She'd never mentioned it. He'd never thanked her for it. That was the kind of understanding that required no language, which was, in Felix's experience, the kind that lasted. He was 41, though his hands read a few years older. The permanent evidence of 15 years engineering automotive systems at a plant outside Windsor, and 4 years since running Rourke's garage by himself out of a former service station on the east end of Millport. He'd been a senior engineer. He was now the town's mechanic. On most days, that felt like the right version of himself, which was something he'd stopped questioning somewhere around year 2. His wife, Adele, had died in January 4 years ago. A winter highway. A transport truck that had drifted across the center line. He didn't think about the specifics if he could help it, but they were always available if he forgot to be careful. He had a daughter named Jess. She was 9 years old and sitting across from him right now with her science fair ribbon on the table between them. Blue, first place, Provincial Qualifier, reading the menu with the focused seriousness she brought to anything she considered a meaningful decision. Dad. Yeah. The poutine. She didn't look up. It says they use real cheese curds from the county co-op. That's how it's supposed to work. I know, but some places use shredded mozzarella and call it poutine. She looked up then. That's not poutine. That's just a lie with gravy on it. He laughed. It came out with the texture of someone who'd been awake since 5:30, but it was completely genuine. She'd been making him laugh this way since she was 4. Calm, absolute statements delivered, as though accuracy were simply a standard the world owed her, and she was noting the specific places it fell short. They'd been coming here every Saturday since the move to Millport. Simone, the server finishing her kinesiology degree at Western part-time, knew Jess always wanted extra napkins. Bev had once sat across from Felix on a slow Wednesday afternoon and asked how he was actually doing. Not the passing version of the question, the real one. And she'd listened to the full answer without making it smaller than it was. This diner wasn't anything remarkable by any external measure, but it was theirs, and 4 years of loss had taught Felix that theirs was a kind of remarkable all its own. He was not quite paying attention to the door when it opened. He heard the heels first. That particular precise rhythm, not loud but deliberate. The sound of someone who had never had reason to consider whether their presence in a room was welcome. Lenora Pratt was in her early 50s, dressed in a wool coat that was not from anything available in Millport, her manner carrying the specific economy of motion of a person who had long since stopped treating other people's time as equivalent to her own. Two people followed her in, a younger woman with a tablet and a man who positioned himself just inside the door and looked at the room the way someone looked at a room they'd been trained to assess. Lenora didn't look around to get her bearings. She evaluated the diner in roughly 2 seconds, found it wanting, and then her eyes landed on the booth by the window. Simone appeared from behind the counter. "Hi there, welcome in. We've got about a 10-minute wait for." "I need that table. Not sharp, not raised. Simply placed, the way you'd state a weather fact." Simone blinked. "That table's occupied right now." "Yes." Lenora was already moving toward the booth. "I have people driving up from London. I need it in a few minutes." Bev came out of the kitchen. She was compact and unhurried, and had handled worse than this for 30 years, and she came to stand at the end of the booth, with her arms loosely crossed. "That table's spoken for on Saturdays," she said. "Going on 3 years. I've got a nice spot near." "I'm not talking to you," said with the flat redirection you'd use on a GPS offering the wrong route. Then to Felix, "You're going to want to think very carefully about this. I have a site coordinator and a city planner driving from London. We need this table. Whatever you've ordered, she can move to the counter." "We haven't gotten our food yet," Felix said. "We just ordered." "Then you haven't started eating." Her hand came down on the back of the booth in a slow, deliberate movement. Her eyes moved across the table. The laminated menu, his coffee, the blue ribbon Jess had laid out flat the way you laid out something you were proud of. "What do you do?" "Not curiosity. Something using the shape of curiosity." "Garage," Felix said. She looked at his hands. The knuckles that were clean but permanently marked in the way that engine work marked you, no matter how carefully you washed. "You drove here?" Another look toward the door. "Not a new vehicle, I'd imagine." The diner had gone entirely quiet. 3 tables of people had stopped pretending to eat. "I want to be direct with you." She said it in the tone of someone performing generosity. "My company has been in discussions with this municipality for 8 months. The planning director is someone I work with closely. A pause measured and deliberate. Very closely." She smiled at her desk. "I think you should understand what it means to make something difficult for me in this town." Her eyes moved to Jess for the first time. Jess, who had put the menu down and gone very still, whose hands had gone below the table. Felix could feel it without looking, his daughter's fingers finding the edge of the booth seat and holding on. He knew that specific quality of stillness. He'd seen it in a hospital corridor when she was 5 years old, and someone was telling her something that 5 years old was not equipped to absorb. That was the thing. Not the look at his hands, not the reference to the planning director. It was Jess's hand under the table, finding something solid to grip so no one could see her face. He looked at his daughter. "Hey." His voice came out level and quiet, the voice he used when she had bad nights, when he sat on the end of her bed at 2 in the morning, talking her back to steady ground. "The poutine. Just tell Simone when she comes by. We've got time." Jess looked at him. She nodded once. Something in her face let go. He looked back up at Lenora Pratt and looked at her the way you looked at someone when you'd finished considering them and arrived at a conclusion that required no further discussion. There was no anger in it. Something quieter, in some ways more final. "We'll be done when we're done," he said. "You're welcome to wait at the counter." Lenora Pratt stood at the end of the booth for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at the ribbon on the table. Then she made a phone call, her voice dropping below anything the surrounding tables could make out, her eyes staying on Felix the entire time. At the corner table, Hugh Warwick had already stepped quietly toward the door. Hugh was 73 years old and had retired from the Ontario Crown Attorney's Office 5 years ago after a career that had included, among other things, the prosecution of a regional planning chair, a municipal contracts director, and a development consultant whose company name still appeared on construction, hoarding around certain newer builds in southwestern Ontario. He was in Millport for the weekend visiting his daughter. He'd eaten at Bev's twice on previous visits. He liked the coffee. He had recognized the mechanism within 30 seconds of Lenora Pratt walking in. The way Simone had pulled back when the name settled into the room the specific language about the planning director, the manner of someone who had learned that a certain quantity of named power, placed correctly, changed what people were willing to do. This was not a wealthy woman having a bad day. This was the visible surface of something that had been operating below the surface for quite some time. He called Alicia Svensson, who had been a junior investigator in his office 14 years ago and was currently leading municipal accountability files at the Ontario Integrity Commissioner's office. She picked up on the second ring. "Hugh, I thought you were retired." "I am retired." He kept his voice even, watching through the diner window. Felix had his hand on top of Jess's on the table now, a small and barely visible thing, entirely natural. He had not moved. He had not raised his voice. He was simply there in the way certain people were simply there, completely. "Are you recording?" A pause, the sound of a chair. "Give me 20 seconds." He gave her 25, because he was still thorough by habit. He told her everything: names, time, location, direct quotes as close to verbatim as memory allowed. He described Simone's reaction when the name entered the room, the security detail the phone call Pratt had made with her eyes fixed on the man in the booth. He described the ribbon on the table and the way the girl's hands had gone below the seat. When he finished, Alicia was quiet for a moment. "We've had a file building on Pratt development for 7 months," she said. "Variance approvals that don't hold up to timeline review. 2 witnesses who won't go on record." A pause. "We've been waiting for a thread." Hugh looked through the window. Lenora Pratt's car was pulling away from the curb. Inside the diner, someone at the counter had started to applaud. Slow, not theatrical, just real. And the sound was spreading, table by table, the way things spread when they're genuine rather than performed. "The father's name is Felix Rourke," Hugh said. "He's not part of this in any investigative capacity. He was there with his daughter." "Understood. He's a private person, Alicia. Whatever comes of this, he doesn't get pulled into the machinery." "I hear you then. Get some rest. We'll handle it from here." He went back inside and finished his tea. He left 20% the way he always did. He walked to his daughter's house and did not speak about the call until the process was already in motion. Millport found out the way small towns found out, sideways, through movement. A woman named Elaine, who had run a bookshop on the main street for 14 years and whose commercial lease had gone non-renewed 18 months ago, called a provincial advocacy number she'd had written on a notepad in her desk drawer for 2 years and never used. A former municipal planning clerk named Douglas, who had left his position after being asked to expedite a variance application he had serious reservations about, spoke first with an employment lawyer and then with Alicia Svensson's office. He'd signed something when he left. The lawyer explained carefully and in some detail what that document covered and what it didn't. These were not dramatic moments. They happened in cars and kitchens and small offices and looked like nothing from the outside. But they were the kind that, added together, began to sound like something. They sounded like exactly what they were. The investigation ran 18 months, 9 witnesses. Financial records subpoenaed from 3 municipal planning offices across the region. A procurement pattern that, laid out in sequence, was almost tedious in its transparency. Variance approvals processed on timelines that didn't reflect the stated workloads of the offices handling them. Consulting fees paid to companies that didn't appear in any provincial business registry until you traced the ownership 2 layers of incorporation back and found a name you recognized. It wasn't elegant, as these things rarely were. It was a series of decisions made by people who had believed, with reasonable justification for some years, that they were safe. Douglas testified at the tribunal for the better part of 2 days. He was not a natural public speaker. He paused often and started sentences over. He did not change a single detail of his account across 4 hours of questioning. When the defense asked whether he might have misread a routine administrative process as irregular, perhaps due to inexperience with standard industry practice, Douglas looked at the questioner steadily and said, "I had been in municipal planning for 11 years. I knew what standard looked like." The room was quiet for a moment after that, not dramatically. Just the specific silence that settled when something true and unperformed was said in a space built to expect performance. The tribunal found in favor of the integrity commissioner on the primary counts. 3 municipal officials were referred to the Provincial Attorney General's office. Lenora Pratt's company was barred from municipal contract bidding in Ontario for 7 years. Her cooperation with the process was noted in the findings. It was not, the report made clear, a mitigating factor. Felix heard about the findings the way he heard about most things that season. From people in the garage, from 2 emails sent by a reporter at the Free Press that he read and archived without answering. He didn't read the full tribunal report. He read the summary. He understood what had happened. Jess found out more of it on a Tuesday evening, watching something on her tablet while he made pasta in the kitchen. She came to the doorway with the expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces they'd been holding for a while. Dad. Yeah. The woman from Bev's. She looked at him steadily. Her company was doing illegal things to small towns. That's what the investigation found. And the man who was sitting near us, he saw it, and he called someone. He did. He was a Crown attorney, retired. She was quiet for a moment, working through it. Was it because of what happened that day? Did us staying at the table actually matter? He turned the burner down. I think it would have come out eventually, he said, because that was what he actually believed. But Hugh being in that diner, seeing what he saw, I think it moved things. Made something possible that wasn't possible before. Jess looked down at the table. Then she said quietly, You didn't do anything big. No. You just stayed. He didn't answer. She went back to the living room. He stood at the stove for a while, listening to the water coming to a boil. Elaine reopened the second room of her bookshop in the spring. The variance process in Millport's planning office was overhauled and made public. A small business resilience fund, proposed by a new councillor and partly sourced through recovered municipal assets, approved its first 11 applicants in March. None of this was front-page news. It was the actual story, the part that happened in the years after the headlines moved on. Bev hung something near the door. She'd written it herself, on good cardstock, in her own handwriting, which was neat and slightly old-fashioned. The handwriting of someone who'd learned to write at a time when people took the formation of letters seriously. She found a plain wooden frame in the back room, hung it herself, got it level on the 3rd try, and decided the faint remaining tilt was fine, because perfect was an overrated standard for things that mattered. The measure of a person is what they do when they think no one is watching. Some people prove us wrong. She didn't post about it. She didn't explain it to anyone who asked. It was simply there, where people saw it going in or coming out, and some of them paused, and some of them didn't, and either way the coffee was still good. 8 years later, on a warm June evening, Jess Rourke stood at a podium in the Millport District High School gymnasium and delivered the valedictorian address to her graduating class. She was 17 now, tall, with her mother's coloring and her own precise, unsparing way of looking at things that had been evident since she was 4 years old. She'd earned valedictorian by a margin her homeroom teacher described to Felix as comfortable. Jess had translated this for him as, I worked very hard, and I also cared a great deal about the details. Felix was in the 4th row with Bev, who had closed the diner early for the occasion and was sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap, her expression arranged into something that communicated composure, but was mostly holding. He'd seen Bev cry exactly once when her grandson was born. He suspected this would make twice. Jess had shown him the speech 3 weeks earlier. He'd read it through twice, slowly, and then looked up and said, Jess, this is good. She'd made the face, the embarrassed, almost smiling face she'd been making since she was 6. You're biased. Obviously, it's still good. Which part? The part about the diner. She'd been quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure I should keep that in. Keep it in. It's personal. Yeah, he'd handed the pages back. That's why it works. Now she stood at the podium in front of 400 people, and she didn't flinch. She talked about a Saturday in November at Bev's diner. She didn't name anyone. She described a man who had held his ground without raising his voice, without spectacle, without asking for anything to be made of it afterward. She described what she'd watched him do in the space of 10 minutes in a booth by the window, not what he'd resisted, but how. The stillness of it, the way he'd put his hand over hers on the table, which she'd been trying very hard not to let anyone see was shaking. She talked about what she'd spent 8 years learning from that afternoon, not from the woman who had walked in, from watching her father in the hours and days and years that followed, the way he'd driven home and made dinner, the way he'd helped her with homework and taken her to soccer and sat at the kitchen table at 11 at night working through her science projects, the way he'd never mentioned it again and never looked for credit for any of it. "My father is not a symbol," she said, and held a short pause. "He's a person who burns things on the stove and once spent the better part of a Sunday looking for his keys that were in his jacket the whole time." Laughter moved through the gymnasium, warm and genuine. Felix looked at the ceiling for a moment. "But he showed me something," she continued, "by being exactly who he was consistently, even when it was inconvenient. That the way you treat people when you think it costs you, nothing is the most accurate version of who you are. And that staying, just staying, without making it into anything larger than it was, can be the thing that makes something else possible. I'm going to study urban planning because I want to build places where what you have doesn't determine who gets protected." She paused, and something in her expression in that moment was entirely her mother's, and Felix felt it move through him the way certain things still move through him. Not like pain, not anymore, but like the full weight of something he'd decided a long time ago he was going to carry correctly. "I know that's a large goal. I know there are people who would call it naive." A small, private smile. "I have strong opinions about large things. I've been told that my entire life." The laughter that came was warmer than the first. "The person who taught me that having strong opinions and actually doing something about them are two completely separate skills you have to build separately." He's sitting in the 4th row. "Hi, Dad." Felix did not trust his face for a few seconds. He looked at the backs of the chairs in front of him, then he looked up at his daughter. Bev beside him had quietly abandoned all pretense of composure and was simply there, which was what she always was. It was enough. Jess closed with something she told him later. She'd taken from a conversation in the garage when she was 9. A cold Saturday in late winter, and she'd come to sit on the workbench and watch him rebuild a carburetor, and had asked, with complete seriousness, why it mattered how you treated someone who had power over you compared to someone who didn't. He'd said, "One of those is a performance. The other one is who you actually are." She hadn't told him she'd kept it. He hadn't known she'd filed it away in the part of herself where she stored things worth keeping. "The test of what you believe," she said, "is what you do when believing it costs you something." The applause began before she'd stepped back from the podium. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in July, Felix walked into Bev's diner with Jess, who had already decided on the poutine before they parked the truck. They sat in the booth by the window. Simone, who had finished her degree and come back to Millport because she found she liked the work and wasn't particularly interested in justifying that to anyone, brought their drinks without being asked. Bev came out of the kitchen. She stood at the end of the booth and looked at Jess with the expression of someone who had watched a person become themselves across a long series of Saturday mornings and found it both completely right and slightly incredible. "Good summer before you go," she said. Jess nodded. "I'm rereading some things, getting ready." "You'll be ready," Bev said. Then to Felix, just a look, the kind that didn't need language and didn't get any. She went back to the kitchen. The poutine arrived properly molten. Jess noted this, as she had noted it since she was 9, with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom accuracy in this particular matter remained a reasonable expectation of the world. Felix had always thought she was exactly right about that. He drank his coffee while it was still hot. Outside, Millport moved through its Saturday. People with somewhere to be and people without, the ordinary invisible work of a place carrying itself forward in the slow, imperfect way places actually changed rather than the way it looked from the outside. The sign near the door caught the morning light. A man coming in with his kids paused to read it, nodded once at it, the way you nodded at something you already knew but hadn't seen said plainly in a while, then found a table and sat down. The espresso machine hissed. Someone's kid was coloring on a paper placemat at the next booth. The radio played low. It was enough. It had always been enough.